how does the United States continue to defend that and still live up to our democratic ideals? A pregnant pause, and he says, no one has ever provided good answers to these questions because there aren't any. So if I can just wind up, you'll excuse me, I wasn't watching the time. But if I can just end off my remarks with respect to a question that I think is pertinent, very pertinent in fact. The presumption of the international community is that the Israeli occupation is not sustainable. In fact, in Resolution 2334, that phrase was actually used, that the occupation is not sustainable. Stéphane Dion, when he commented upon the Middle East conflict, he said that the status quo is not sustainable. I beg to differ with respect to this. And if I can just point out some matters to you. As the Middle East peace process, and for those of you who know your Charles Dickens, I call it the Jarndyce versus Jarndyce of international diplomacy. Jarndyce was that case in Bleak House that went on for 25 years, and the only people ever gained by it were the lawyers. As the Middle East peace process has been emptied of ideas and energy, the relentless facts on the ground are establishing their own reality. Occupation is deepening and becoming more entrenched. In the 2 years since the beginning of 2017, the Israeli settlement enterprise has witnessed the greatest number of settlement starts, of construction starts in 2000. The Knesset has adopted legislation both to retroactively legalize a number of unauthorized outposts and to legitimize the confiscation of private Palestinian land in the West Bank for Jewish settlements. Israel has expanded its presence in Area C, which makes up 60% of the West Bank. The Knesset came very close to enacting legislation that would informally annex several major West Bank settlement blocks to Jerusalem. The Israeli leadership has become much more open, much more verbally visible with respect to its vision for a permanent occupation. Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that the most he would yield to the Palestinians is a state minus, with all of the settlement blocks and the Jordan Valley remaining in Israel's possession. Many of his cabinet ministers have been even blunter. Indeed, okay, let me continue. And 6, the acute humanitarian crisis in Jerusalem, instigated by the decade-long Israeli blockade, has deteriorated even further. Some have said the ongoing occupation is simply unsustainable, premised on the supposedly irreducible fact that Israel has no demographic or political choice, but to withdraw from all or most of the occupied territory and allow a sovereign Palestinian state to emerge if it is to preserve its Jewish character and democratic values. I think this working assumption by much of the world has been left behind by the galloping realities of the occupation. One, this assumption fails to account for the creative thinking of the ascendant Israeli right that it could comfortably live with models of permanent rule over the Palestinians that would deny them citizenship and democratic rights. And indeed, I think you'd see among most of the ascendant right-wing political parties in Israel, they'd be content to have this matter settled with the Palestinians accepting a tiny Bantustan or statelet in about half or less than half of the West Bank. They could have their seat in the United Nations, they could have their own stamps, they could have their own currency, and they can call themselves a state, but it would not be a state that any definition known to political scientists would wind up recognizing. Number two, I think this assumption of the unsustainability of the Israeli occupation overlooks the striking degree of control that Israel exercises over the Palestinians as it confines them to smaller, denser, and more fragmented islands of land through a sophisticated security network of walls, checkpoints, control over the population registry, and overwhelming military superiority. Thirdly, it overestimates the willingness of the Oslo partners, Europe, who is Israel's largest trading partner, and the United States, which is its military and diplomatic patron, to challenge Israel with any meaningful consequences should it retreat, as it has, from any lingering commitment to a genuine two-state solution. Fourth, this assumption disregards Oslo's escape clauses that have permitted Israel to pocket the cost-free features of the occupation. The large amounts of European and international aid to fund the Palestinians, and the annual almost $4 billion of U.S. military aid coming from the United States, while continuing to thicken its presence through the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while also blockading Gaza. And fifth and finally, this unsustainability assumption begs the question as to whether a genuine two-state solution was ever possible in the absence of the international community's political will to enforce the clear obligations and prohibitions of international law that would have stemmed Israel's expansionism over the past half-century. And if I can just conclude on this point, I've given you 50 or so minutes of gloom and of doom. I'm sometimes called the gloomy optimist when I want to lecture on this. But if I can say this, the reason why I continue to do this work, and my work, I should emphasize, is unpaid. It's volunteer work. I keep my day job as a law professor at the University of Western Ontario. I don't get a cent for doing any of this, nor would I really want it. But what keeps me going, and what keeps my optimism up, is the splendid, courageous, and highly professional work done by international, Israeli, and Palestinian NGOs and civil society, whose work, whose focus is on the occupation in the Palestinian territory. And what that taught me is that ultimately this conflict is not over ethnicity, it's not over religion, it's over human rights. And there is a segment, I wish it was bigger, but there is a certain segment of Israeli Jewish society that are Israelis of conscience, that recognize that there are significant, ongoing, and deeply entrenched human rights violations that are occurring in their name in the occupied Palestinian territories. And they work productively and closely with Palestinian human rights groups under great odds for both of them. The Israeli government is not at all happy with respect to this, and the civil space for the work of these Israeli human rights organizations working on this question is steadily shrinking, both through defamation and slander coming from the Israeli political leadership towards these organizations, as well as legislation that's enacted in the Israeli Knesset that attempts to try to limit the kinds of funding that these organizations get, particularly from international public sources. And the same is true with respect to Palestinian human rights organizations. Their principal work is on the what is caused, the misery that's caused the Palestinians by the occupation. But they also use the same human rights standards to judge their own governance by. These leading human rights organizations like Al-Haq, or Al-Mazin, or Diakonia in the Palestinian Society will also take a look at what the work being done by a Palestinian Authority or by Hamas as well. They work under perilous circumstances, and they deserve our support, financial, moral. Many of them are funded directly or indirectly by European governments, and that is to the European credit. They're not funded by the Canadian government. It used to, some time ago, fund some of these organizations. And if you have access to your own MPs, to get them interested with respect to issues involving Israel and Palestine, one of the things you can wind up urging them to do is to have Canada renew its support. They do support Palestinian organizations that do work among women. That's commendable. They do support, particularly among those small Palestinian organizations that work in the LGBT community. That's commendable. But they don't fund organizations that wind up doing work with respect to the occupation. And that is a big gap with respect to promise and performance. I've spoken already too long. You've been a very good audience, and I'm happy to take any questions that you wind up having. Thank you very much.
Might as well check this out. Michael, I just want to, it's my great pleasure to thank you for having come here. But I'd also like to thank the audience not only because it's a cold, cold night, but just for being here to listen. If you're from Palestine, you're from the region, and have lost the most or know the most about what's happening, or if you've been listening for a long time, or especially if you've never been here before, thank you so much for coming on today. As a token for our appreciation, we just have some wonderful Palestinian olive oil, and of course famous at
It's not that right. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you. And I think Christine is going to take on.
Okay, very good. So I'll ask you to be my filter then?
Yes,
Is that
I
right?
will.
Okay.
And I know Ken has a word to say. And you're going to be next. So you can put down your hand for now, but because Ken has something that he needs to communicate with us.
Brothers and sisters, I'm about to show you something.
You need to use the mic like this.
Thank you. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to show you something that gives new meaning to the phrase "to pass the hat," and here it is. This hat was designed by Susan Goetz, a local artist in Hamilton, who will soon be having an exhibition soon in Hamilton. And it sports the initials of our coalition, which is the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. It also sports a ban the bomb symbol and a button that says "Don't Bomb Syria." It has a nice handle. But most important, it has a copious area in the middle, which is for your paper, currency, and coinage. And so on behalf of the coalition, I wanted to say that we incurred some expenses to bring Professor Lynk not only here, but to McMaster University this morning, where we had 90 people in attendance, out for an hour and a half during class time. And there were other groups that sponsored this visit by Professor Lynk to Hamilton, and they probably also have expenses that have to be covered. So I'm going to ask you generously to donate to covering the expenses of the evening, and anything that's left over will be used for continuing Palestinian solidarity work and for general work towards peace in the world. So I'll come down the aisle. Thank you very much.
It's from Michael.
Thank you. And please donate generously. Thank you.
So we have some time for question and answers, and I have the privilege of navigating this time. I'm going to ask you to identify yourself by name. I also would like to invite you you need to come up to the mic because you're first. Yeah. Identify, if you're affiliated with any organization, to identify yourself that way. We ask that if you are going to, if you have a statement to make, that's fine, as long as you keep your statement to within 2 minutes. Please, we don't want you to go on and on, but predominantly we're open to questions. When I say we, I mean he. So, sorry, Paul, I'm just gonna, because I promised him he would go first, and you have a very short question, right? Yes. Yes.
Well, let's see.
Because I'm going to interrupt you, and I'll interrupt any of you with my sound man back there.
You gotta get close to that microphone.
How's this?
Yep, can you just state your question then?
Okay. My question is this. Why has the United Nations not gone into Israel and treated it like it treated, for example, the Korean War, or World War II, or any of those other massive occupations by another country? The United Nations has done this before. How long is it going to take? How many people are going to have to suffer? How many are going to have to die? And how close is it going to have to come to World War III before the United Nations finally gets off its ass and actually sends in military force? Because I think it has become abundantly clear that the only word that the people running the Zionist system understand is force. That's what they do, that's what they use, and that's what they do. I mean, nobody can deny that. That is what they do. They start one war after another. They victimize innocent people. They starve them. They poison them. And they keep them in what is referred to as the world's largest open-air prison, where they use them as basically target practice.
Thank you for your question. Michael, would you like to-
Okay. International diplomacy and international politics and international law would require that any kind of conflict should be settled. There should be a spectrum of actions you take in trying to bring that conflict to an end. And war and invasion would be your very last resort if nothing else is going to wind up working. I think the two things that are going to change, I think, the dynamics in what is now a very frozen conflict would be the start of a more widespread, because it does exist already, but a widespread Palestinian civil disobedience movement. Their choice is going to have, it's their choice of how they wind up dealing with this endless occupation. But it seems to me choosing peaceful, non-violent civil disobedience means is going to get them the furthest ahead. It's going to lead them to win the greatest amount of popular and public international sympathy.
Oh, yeah.
And the other half of that,
works so far.
and the other half of that is going to have to be international. This conflict, like many other conflicts, is not going to come to an end unless there is a more resolute approach by the international community, probably to start drawing bright red lines with respect to Israel's ongoing defiance of the series of UN resolutions that I've wound up mentioning. It may mean any kinds of, a wide choice of any kinds of international consequences for Israel with respect to ability to enter into international agreements, the ability to join international, or stay in international organizations, a range of different ways in which the international community can choose in terms of its menu to decide how to wind up making what is now a largely cost-free occupation to have a larger cost to it.
I hope you were able to hear his answer. Thank you for your question, Paul. And then you.
Hi, my question's going to be a little simple.
Sorry, I forgot. You need to identify yourself.
My name is Paul Weinberg. I live in Hamilton. My question for Professor Lynk is, can you comment on the cuts that have been made to UNRWA and other U.S. congressional actions might put pressure on the Palestinians?
Yeah, the United States is a very good question. The question, if people didn't hear it clearly, is if I could comment on the recent cuts made by the current American administration with respect to both UNRWA and other forms of aid going to the Palestinians. There were three different groupings of aid that the Americans have made to the Palestinians over the last number of years. First was going to UNRWA, the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, which is the UN agency specifically devoted to the education, health, and welfare of Palestinian refugees, both in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, Syria, and in Jordan as well. And the United States, up until last year, contributed approximately 30 to 32% of the budget of UNRWA. And it announced this time last year, it made one last $60 million contribution. And it was going to withdraw all the remainder of its contribution, which was somewhere in the range of, I think it was around $260 million, $270 million in total. I may not have that figure accurate, but it was a significant figure like that. So UNRWA, all of a sudden, which has always been chronically underfunded, now was in a significant financial crisis. And it's made that up partly through increased contributions from Arab states, from Europe. Canada, to its credit, increased its contributions to UNRWA as well. The second form of American funding, which has just been cut off almost totally, was funding going to both the Palestinian Authority and to a number of Palestinian NGOs through USAID. And that funding has been entirely cut off. And there is a number of Palestinian, or sometimes Palestinian and Israeli groups who have lost some or indeed all of their funding, and those groups are now shuttering their doors. They were largely either humanitarian groups or social service groups performing, in some cases, vital work in the occupied territories that couldn't be done by the Palestinian Authority. And the third range of monies that the United States had traditionally given, and I don't know the figure for this, but the United States was the primary funder of security training and security salary going to the Palestinian police and to its various security forces. Curiously enough, that continues. That's the one area where the United States did not cut. There's been some debate in Congress over the last week with respect to this. There were some who wanted to have that cut as well, and in fact Israel then began to lobby, the Israeli embassy began to lobby to make sure that funding did not get cut. I spoke with a Canadian official who's quite familiar with what's going on in the West Bank a few weeks ago, the last few weeks, and he said the difference for the Israeli army between having that funding going to the Palestinian security apparatus and not having it going there was the difference between 15 Israeli battalions in the West Bank and 45 Israeli battalions in the West Bank. So in fact, it's a subsidy not only for jobs and a small security apparatus for the Palestinians, but it also removes the cost from the Israelis from having to place a much larger Israeli presence, which would be much more exposed, I guess, to the wrath of the Palestinian population that's there.
Sorry, it's Paul.
I'm Paul Ducar, and retired McMaster and Center for Peace Studies Director, and currently member of the Israel-Palestine Working Group of the Canadian Friends Service Committee. I am Jewish ethnically, have family in Israel, and have traveled in and out over the last 40 years, and have come to the painful conclusion that there is no two-state solution any longer. So could you discuss very briefly, I guess my question is, what would a one-state solution look like? Is that even conceivable? That is it conceivable that Israel could remain democratic, or would want Israeli Jews would want to remain democratic when demographically ultimately would lead to a Palestinian majority state?
Sure. And as I indicated, and I'll say it a little more expressly now, right now the population ratio of Israeli Jews to Palestinian Arabs between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is almost 50-50. I believe there may be, census suggests that there may be roughly about 100,000 more Israeli Jews now, or somewhere in that ballpark, to Palestinian Arabs. But that ratio had been much larger, and it's shrinking, and sometime soon, probably within the next several years, it may well be that Palestinian Arabs overtake Israeli Jews with respect to them. There are 4 potential paths forward with respect to Israel and Palestine. One is a continuation of what we're doing right now, which is an ongoing entrenchment of the occupation, continuing blockade of Gaza, but no formal annexation of the West Bank. In other words, the Israelis are content to choose a moment in the future where they may choose that, but they will continue with the current status quo. It serves them well. They have a fence around Gaza. They have a wall around the West Bank. Most Israelis, unless they're serving in the army, don't see Palestinians or don't see those Palestinians. It's like 20 kilometers from you is now on the far side of the moon. They're largely invisible. A second choice is a genuine two-state solution, which is where the current diplomatic consensus in the world is. But I have to agree with you, is that I think we've passed, or we are passing, or have already sped past the last exit on the road to an entrenched occupation, of which a two-state solution would be virtually impossible. If Israel faced a huge national debate and anguish over the removal of 8,000 Israeli settlers in 2005 from Gaza, there are approximately somewhere between 80 to 100,000 Israeli settlers on the east side of the separation wall. For them to be uprooted, because they are throughout the hills and mountains in the West Bank, as well as being in the Jordan River, for them to be uprooted strikes me as requiring more political will and a much greater operation than I can imagine Israeli consensus, current right-wing consensus, would wind up saying. If you read a whole list of what Israeli political leaders are saying, they're saying either let's annex Area C now, or everything is ours, and we're just waiting for the right moment. So that's option number 2, is a genuine two-state solution, which appears to have passed its best-by date. The third option is a one-state solution, which is dominated by Israel, of which there are no rights or very little rights in terms of civic rights belonging to the Palestinians. In other words, Israel annexes most, if not all, of the Palestinian territory, but not Gaza, of the West Bank. And I've seen several of these articles that really are quite creative, written by right-wing Israeli thinkers about how you manage the Palestinians if you decide to annex all of those territories. But it would, believe me, that means, and I think this is what one of the pauses that Israeli political thinkers, these thinkers have, is that this would be the A word. This would be apartheid. It would be apartheid pure and simple. And that would then start, obviously, a Palestinian move for one person, one vote in a democratic one-state solution. But the world would probably not put up with, even the United States, under current circumstances, but who knows what happens in 10 years' time, may not put up with that. But that certainly is the dream of the current Israeli right, and the current Israeli right is in power, and it will be returned to power almost certainly after April 9th in the next elections. And the fourth and final solution would be a one-state democratic solution, where the 6.5 million Israeli Jews and the 6.4 million Israeli Palestinian Arabs would all have a vote, and it would transform, obviously, the institutions there. Let's hope they remain democratic. One of the benefits of that, if you think of it this way, is that there are democratic institutions in Israel, in terms of its Knesset, in terms of its courts. The courts, of course, view the law through a very distinct Israeli Jewish filter in terms of how and the laws reflect that as well. But those institutions are relatively solid. And as we saw in South Africa, it's quite possible for the courts, once you make the passage from apartheid to a modern democratic state, if those institutions are solid enough, they can transform with the new political reality and provide the kind of stability that you need for a democratic state for all the travails that modern South Africa is going through. And I use that cautiously, because I think there are differences between Israel, Palestine, and South Africa, but there also are, unfortunately, a lot of similarities as well. So those, I think, are the four potential routes of where this conflict could go. Two of them are hopeful. I think, whatever else you say about a one-state democratic solution, it offers more to the Palestinians than what I think the Israeli Jews are willing to offer in any other of these circumstances. And certainly is closer to what we think of with respect to democratic ideals. A two-state solution, which had the world's consensus, and certainly the consensus among Palestinians, something along the idea of the often referenced Arab peace plan of 2002, seemed to offer the greatest hope. But I remember reading a piece in the New York Times a week ago where the deputy Washington editor of the New York Times called it a cruel joke to keep thinking that. And it seems that a two-state solution increasingly is that kind of empty mantra that is repeated by European or North American diplomats to excuse any substantive change in their policy to bring about that with respect to. So those are where I think the cards wind up laying, and wiser people than I will have to try to figure out where current situations on the ground are leading in that direction. But right now, the direction is a further entrenchment of the first option that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Kevin?
Thank you for a very instructive talk. I really appreciated it.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I wanted to do thanks first. Kevin McKay, professor at Mohawk College, member of the Faculty Association Political Action Committee, and someone who's been following this issue for a while. It's a bit of a two-parter, but I'm going to keep this as concise as possible. There is an analysis out there that this conflict will only end when there's political change in the United States, which is the main supporter of the State of Israel. You mentioned just under $4 billion a year in military funding. So I'm wondering just if I could get your take on that analysis. And the second part of it relates to Canada and our really disturbing political shift in terms of our government's relationship to Israel-Palestine. Trudeau's recent moves to further the criminalization of criticism of Israel and BDS and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you could comment on first the United States and then also Canada's involvement in the conflict?
Sure, and I'll try to be as brief as you are, or succinct as you are with respect to your very good question. Number one, with respect to the United States, yes, that is one of the keys. I think you begin to see a slow change in popular opinion and in even elite opinion with respect to Israel-Palestine. I don't claim to be an expert with respect to the American political system. I do read the New York Times on a regular, I daily or maybe twice daily basis. I do pay attention to debates that go on in the United States with respect to Israel-Palestine. You now have obviously a very small minority, but you now have 2 congresswomen elected now who actually have very distinct, very strong views on Israel-Palestine, including one of them who's Palestinian herself. That's a long ways from a majority in Congress, but it opens up the door to a greater debate. I notice myself when I read the New York Times that there is a much wider range of published op-eds on Israel-Palestine than they ever had before, and that you would ever see in Canada with regards to this. They publish on a wide range of spectrums, from those who are strong supporters of Israel, all the way to those who are quite critical of the occupation and what's going on there as well. So public opinion change is slow, and it'll probably be maybe beyond my lifetime, the lifetime of many of yours, before you see decisive change with respect to that. You have to think that the worse that things get in Israel and Palestine, particularly with respect to the occupation, the harder it is for people not to be forming distinct opinions. And we see this with respect to polling in Canada. The polling in Canada shows that there is among Canadians, a decisive change with respect to support for Israel towards support for Palestinians. That's not reflected in elite opinion or elite political opinion. And we don't have that kind of access with respect to being able to put critical commentary in newspapers. I've been able to get one piece since I became Special Rapporteur in the Globe and Mail, which is probably one more than I ever expected to wind up getting. But I'm not expecting to get one again. I'm successful. I try to write op-eds every 3 or 4 months, and I have been able to get them published in various international online publications with respect to this, but it's not happening in Canada. As long as CBC or the Globe and Mail, or to a lesser extent even the Toronto Star, have their pages closed to respect to this. And in terms of current Canadian foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine, it's quite disparate. The 2 changes that occurred once Justin Trudeau took power in November 2015 was, one, he should be commended for restoring the funding to UNRWA that was cut by the Harper government. And 2, there certainly was a change in tone from the rather belligerent Israel right or wrong that Stephen Harper had put forth. But I'm critical of their voting. Their voting did not change at the UN General Assembly. They continue to be in a group of 6 or 7 or 8 countries that vote against all those resolutions that go through in December. Against 155 or 160 countries voting in favor. And that may have a blowback to Canada. Canada's running for a Security Council seat in 2020. One of the reasons why it lost its last chance in 2012 was because of the Harper record with respect to Israel-Palestine. It wasn't the only reason, but it certainly was a contributing reason. If you listen to what former UN Canadian ambassadors have said with respect to that. And when you put us up against the 2 countries that Canada's running against for those 2 Security Council seats, they're running against Ireland and they're running against Norway. Go take a look at the voting with Ireland and Norway certainly on the questions of Palestine. And again, I don't think this is going to be decided only on that. But from my trips and talks, extensive talks in Geneva, in New York, and Amman, and Berlin, wherever else I wind up going, people know the Canadian voting record with respect to Israel and Palestine. They know the voting record of Norway. They know the voting record of Ireland. Those are both, probably 2 of the most progressive countries, along with Sweden and Belgium, with respect to this issue within the European continent. If that becomes an important factor, or even one of the contributing factors for where the votes will go, Canada may wind up losing again on this. And the last thing I'll point out is that Canada has renegotiated its 20-year-old free trade agreement with Israel. And in the new agreement, it added a number of chapters, including chapters on gender, on labor, on corporate responsibility. It did not do anything with respect to adding any statement or provision with respect to human rights, as the European Free Trade Agreement with Israel does have. It said nothing with respect to making sure that the Israeli Customs Union does not permit goods made in industrial parks and settlements illegally placed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem from entering Canada on a tariff-free basis, along with any other Israeli goods. Both of those are absent. And I followed the debates going on in the House of Commons with respect to this. You know, to their credit, the New Democratic Party are raising both those issues as to reasons why this agreement should be either renegotiated or not brought forward. The other parties, the Greens, I believe, are taking the same position. I believe as well the Bloc Québécois is taking that position, but the Conservatives and Liberals are solid behind the agreement that is there right now. So that was a long-winded answer to your question.
Henry Evans, Tenbury, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, as well as the Canadian Congress of Union Retirees. I'm wondering if you have a brief comment on what I think is one of the most egregious crimes that's being committed, and that's crimes against the children of Palestine. Children are being, their homes are being invaded by Israeli military in the middle of the night, and children as young as 5 and 6 are being thrown in prison, subject to military tribunal. There are school children basically running the gauntlet on a daily basis, being subject to tear gas and stun grenades by the military. I'm just wondering if you have a comment on that.
Sure. There's an organization that's based in New York that I've talked to on several occasions called Defense of Children International-Palestine, and whose main officer is a young New York lawyer that does exemplary work with respect to issues of children under the occupation. And I just read, I saw a report, I haven't read it yet, that they issued in the last week or two to the UN Commission of Inquiry with respect to the shootings at the Gaza frontier over the last 9 or 10 months. And that is due to report to the UN Human Rights Council at the end of March. And that report details, you know, I think it's in the range of 30 children under the age of 14, or under the age of 16, sorry, who were killed by Israeli sniper fire at the fence from March until now by the Israeli military. These were children who were unarmed. In fact, not all, but most of the demonstrators who were there were unarmed, presenting no threat to the Israeli military forces. There are very clear, very strict rules under international law with respect to the use of weaponry and lethal fire by police and security forces against demonstrators. And you are not allowed to use disproportionate weaponry against civilians. And where your life is not an imminent threat, you are not permitted to shoot and kill demonstrators. And if you look at the stories of some of these shootings, particularly these children, who were tens or hundreds of meters away from the fence while these demonstrations were going on. I mean, they were not the only ones who were killed who were in passive positions. There were some who were medics, some who were journalists who were wound up shot and being killed. Turning to the West Bank, yes, there are Israeli military courts that will arrest and try children. It was reported several years ago that the conviction rate in these military courts is over 99%. So you have children being arrested, removed from their families, and be kept in detention for days or even weeks. Probably many of you know the story of the Tamimi family and of Had Tamimi, who was 16 when she was arrested in December of 2017, and wound up being imprisoned as a child for 8 months in Israeli prison. That she received a great deal of attention with respect to that, but that unfortunately is far from the only story for how that winds up operating. So if you want to know more about that, I urge you to look online at the work of Defense for Children International Palestine. They have a campaign which they're trying to bring to Ottawa called No Way to Treat a Child, and I think it's a very effective way of trying to bring some of the core issues with respect to this conflict to the attention of members of Parliament. And I urge you, as one of your repertoire, if you are interested in trying to further work on this issue, to pay attention to the work of Defense of Children International.
David?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much. Just to introduce myself, my name is David Masseria, and I've recently moved here to Hamilton. I'm a rabbi. I'm active in a group called Independent Jewish Voices here in Canada that is a human rights organization made of Jews that are really fighting for justice for Palestinians. And I'm also active with a group called Jewish Voice for Peace that is in the U.S. Doing a
Same
lot,
thing.
yeah, even more and even better. I also just like to say personally, I've lived in Israel for 4 years. My 2 adult children are there now. I'm looking forward to going there around the end of April and being involved with Palestinians and Jews who are doing the kinds of things you're talking about. I basically want to kind of comment on 2 things you said with a different perspective than what you said. And I listened to you earlier today and again today.
You're a brave man.
I'm nodding, I'm nodding, and then suddenly I realized something you've said doesn't actually, I think it needs some commentary. When you talked about the occupation being essentially cost-free, I don't think that's true at all. I think it has an enormous cost, and what I mean is Israel probably has the highest military budget per capita of any country in the world, and has for decades and decades. Essentially, every young person in Israel, let's say at least 80 or so percent, know when they graduate high school, they're going to be spending years of their lives in the military. Every public place you go in Israel, from a movie theater to a bus stop, a grocery store, you cannot walk in without having your bags checked. Israelis cannot travel on their own passports to many countries in the world. They know this. Israel knows that their reputation around the world is that they are basically like savages, like a rogue state. The things you've been talking about here tonight are known to Israelis, despite the truth of what you said, that they don't come in personal contact with Palestinians. I could go on with this list. Besides, for many years, there really were terrorist attacks in Israel, buses being blown up, bombs thrown into cafes. We all know this. So I get the point of what you're saying, but I want to look at that a little more carefully.
If I could just comment before you go on to your second point.
Well, I wasn't getting ready for the second point.
All I'm going to say is,
you know what I think is Israelis and Israel as a collectivity are willing to pay a very big price. They bear the price of this occupation. And in recent years, 2-3 decades, more and more of the political consensus in Israel is that they will take on more of a price. The Israeli peace camp, the Israeli left is virtually gone. There's this like a wall-to-wall consensus that we will bear up under the burden of maintaining this occupation. That was my first point.
Okay, I'll just briefly comment with respect to that. David, I think your point is very good. I made a point which I think, in a narrow sense, I think is true, but you're adding a lot more nuance to it than I did. And I hear you on that, because it's impossible for a country occupying another country, particularly one 20 kilometers, where the occupation is 20 kilometers away, without beginning to pay a huge price with respect to moral corrosion and with corruption in many ways, not the simple corruption of financial corruption, but corruption in terms of institutions that it has in the way they want to govern themselves, the way in which they think about themselves. So I think I agree precisely with your point, and I certainly accept it. It's cost-free only in the sense that they've been able to persuade the Europeans and the Americans to bear most of the financial cost with respect to the running of the occupation, where it normally would be the sole financial bearer of the occupying power. Yours is a much larger point, and yours is entirely correct.
And your second commentary is brief?
I will make it brief. Another thing I can say is that something like 70% of Jewish Israelis want to be able to move away. Hundreds of thousands have because of this untenable situation. That was one thing. The second thing is I want to comment on your third possible future, which was that Israel will simply maintain this occupation. It will extend.
It'll formalize it.
I think part of that image for Israelis is that eventually Palestinians give up and go away. I'll just leave it at that. That Israel does kick them out little by little.
Yeah.
Israel makes life miserable for them. I know many Palestinians who just, if they have an option to leave, life will be better for them elsewhere, no matter how loyal and patriotic they are about their own land.
Yeah.
But Israel's image is not, we rule over these people forever. We rule over them until they finally give up and go away. I'll just leave it.
No, and I'll make a very brief point. Is there certainly is an element among some of the Israeli political leadership that would want to see, either expressly or wordlessly, they want to see a defeat of the Palestinians rather than a compromise and a sharing with the Palestinians. And the only way they're going to be able to sustain their presence from the Jordan to the Mediterranean is through an absolute defeat, utter despair, and then probably voluntary exile by the Palestinians. And your point again is well taken, and I accept it. Just so it's 10 to 9. I've got to get back to London tonight, so I was going to suggest another 10 minutes, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
that's what we're hoping. And this might be the last two.
Okay, excuse me, I'm next.
Sorry, no, actually, he's next because
You'll have time. I will answer your question.
He just couldn't stand. He couldn't remain standing all that time.
But I will take your question.
Yeah, well,
Identify yourself.
yes, my name is Desmond Sequeira. I'm from St. Catharines, and I am part of a fledgling organization in St. Catharines called the Movement for Justice in Israel, in Palestine, Israel. It's a little bit depressing, of course, to hear what you said, which, of course, we would heard a long time, and we've been hearing for decades. If there's one word that can describe the government of Israel, and I'm not talking about Jews, but the government of Israel, it's intransigence. And it's been aided and abetted by Western powers, especially Europeans and North Americans. The question is this: what can we in Canada, especially given the disposition of our government, and Prime Minister Trudeau just the other day at Brock University once more condemned BDS. What can we do in a coordinated way to really, well, use the word force our government to take a stand which is proactive in support of Palestinians?
Thank you very much.
An excellent question, of which I could be here for the next half hour trying to answer, and in which I'm sure there's lots of other good opinions in the audience here. But if I can try to be succinct in answering your question, it's not going to happen. We're not going to see a substantive change in the Canadian government's position on this, unless and until I think more voices wind up getting heard in a louder and more persistent and a more consistent way. As I said to you before, there is polling that suggests that Canadians are increasingly viewing the Palestine-Israeli conflict through the lens of an occupier and an occupied, and a people struggling to want to be free in the way that they can. That is not shared by elite opinion, and while I think that opinion is broad among Canadians, I don't think it's very deep. I don't think it's an issue that, for most Canadians, it determines their vote. I don't think for most Canadians yet, it determines on how and when they're going to contact their member of parliament. I think the only way that foreign policy gets changed is when there is, probably at several different levels, there's more elite opinion that's beginning to accept this as a perennial problem and a stain on Canada's record, and among popular opinion, when people begin to write to their editors with op-eds or with letters, begin to write to their MPs, and begin to write to their foreign minister, saying, what's going on there in the Middle East is wrong, and it's going to continue to get worse, and your policy is the antithesis of what is needed to be able to bring peace and justice to the Middle East. So it means be willing to write more letters. It means to be willing to have more meetings like this. It means trying to find more visibility for your views in a range of areas on social media. And many young people are taking this up. We're much smarter with social media than most of us. I don't see that many people here under 30, but I have great hope. I have great hope for people under the age of 30 beginning to use the new tools of communication that they have and bypassing some of the old established routes, beginning to articulate the need for change in Canadian policy. That's a 1 minute or 2 minute answer to what could be a 30-minute answer with respect to that. Sir.
Hello, thank you. My name is Murray Sacha,
Yeah.
and I like to dabble in the political scene and throughout the world. I'm going to make a couple of comments. First of all, the United States is the worst terrorist organization in the world.
You're here.
And they're being they're being influenced by the Jewish people in North America to have their terrible voting record at the United Nations. Now, I think somehow they got to bring some sanctions against Israel, like the states are doing against Russia, to stop this, to put pressure on them, because this is terrible. And I can't understand the Jewish people. Not all of them, mind you, but the Holocaust during the Second World War was terrible. But they're doing the same thing to the Palestinian people today. Why? And, oh yeah, the question there, why did England promote this Jewish state back in 1948?
Why did England
promote Israel back in 1948?
Okay. In fact, in 1947, I think it was.
Or 47, okay, but
you'd find that Britain actually was neutral on this particular question. When in the United Nations, they didn't vote either way with respect to the partition resolution that came in November 1947, because they were trying to extract themselves from the running of the mandate. It had become beyond their resources to be able to run. And when the decisive vote came on the 29th of November 1947, they abstained. Look, it's a much longer history lesson with respect to the British power with respect to 1917 onward. Look, one thing I'd suggest is I think we have to be more careful with respect to our words, with respect to particularly with respect to Jews. You know, in the work that I wind up doing, I of course encounter a wide spectrum of views from a wide spectrum of people, including Canadian Jews, American Jews, Israelis as well. But I will say that I come across a lot of Israelis of conscience who do work in their NGOs and in their political parties, trying to bring an end to this occupation and trying to find.
Yeah, they seem to be in a minority.
You're right. It is a small but growing section with respect to that. But what I said is, as I said before, what I've learned from them and from the work that they do, and from the very first encounters I ever had on the Middle East is when I was a young student in the mid or late 70s at McGill University. And it was the very first time I ever learned about the issue of Palestine. And who did I learn that from? I learned it from a crew of Canadian and American Jews who were advocating peace and equality between Israel and Palestinians. And that was astonishing to me. I'd always assumed there was a monolith of views within the Jewish community with respect to this. And that shattered that view. That shattered that view happily. Because I now realize that at the end of the day, as I said before, this is not a conflict over ethnicity or language or religion as much as it is a conflict over rights. And there are Jews, Israeli Jews, and Jews in the diaspora who recognize that and recognize that very clearly. So in fact, I'm always happy to try to quote both Israeli as well as Palestinian human rights organizations, because I want people to see through the prism of my reports that there are steadfast Israelis of conscience who have said some of the most critical things about Israel, and they still are allowed to be able to do that. And that is actually helping to expand the democratic discourse in Israel.
Just one thing, I must say, thank God for the one Jewish fella, Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking.
I have a couple of short announcements. First of all, I want to say that thanks to your generous contributions, we have raised close to $500 tonight. Secondly, on your way out, you may wish to stop at the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the Wars literature table, or at the Jewish Liberation Theology Institute table.